This lecture looks at immigration to the United States, and it's particularly looking at immigration during the late 1800s, around the 1880s or so, and into the early 1900s, ending around 1920, which is when a number of laws, the U.S. government will pass a number of laws designed to restrict immigration that'll be in effect for a few decades during this period. And what this lecture is meant to show is kind of an overview, is to give you an idea of who's coming to the United States during this period, what they're facing once they get here, and what was the reaction of people who were already here to these newcomers, both from a social standpoint, meaning people, everyday people and their reactions, and also the political perspective of all of this and how politics played a role in the issue of immigration in the United States. Now, we have to remember that America is a changing country by the end of the 19th century in a number of ways, both technologically, industrially. We are a modern, rapidly advancing country with a need for a large labor force to work the new factory jobs that are increasingly available in the United States. And presumably a lot of land, especially in the West, that is ripe for settlement. And because of that, we do see an influx of immigration to the U.S. during this period, particularly from people from Europe. Now, immigration is not a new thing, of course. Immigrants have been coming to the United States for decades by this point, centuries even. But what is new is where these people are coming from, these new immigrants. Traditionally, most immigrants to this country had come from the western part of Europe, northwestern part of Europe especially, places like Germany, Ireland, Great Britain in general. But that's going to change during this period. What we see by the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s is that more and more people are going to come from different parts of Europe, particularly Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. Southern Europe countries like Italy, Eastern European countries and Central European countries like Austria-Hungary, Russia. And these people who are coming now, often in great numbers during this period. In fact, to give you an idea of these numbers, if we look at the statistics for these decades when immigrants were coming to this country, you see a total immigrant population from Europe during this period between 1880 and 1890 of 4.6 million people arriving. 1890 to 1899, 3.5 million. 1900 to 1909, 7.5 million. These are the numbers of immigrants coming. And they're, like I said, coming from sometimes and oftentimes now different parts of Europe. And they're coming to the United States really for the reasons that immigrants typically come here. The chance to seek a better life, the chance to find a job, the chance to support their families better. And they're often escaping famines at home, war at home, a very tense political situations, uncertain political futures. Oftentimes they're even being encouraged to leave through advertisements. The idea of encouraging immigrants to leave a certain country and come to the United States was a big business, especially with shipping lines who made their money off of transporting immigrants from European nations to the United States. And so there's an advertising component to all of this and a marketing component to all of this that's encouraging many immigrants to come seek new lives in the U.S. And so these are some of the reasons why many immigrants, especially from Italy and parts of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, are coming to the United States during these decades. These new groups who are coming, and in large numbers, don't always match those who already live here in the United States, the Americans who are already here. And that's going to cause conflict. These new groups from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, they dress differently. They have different religious beliefs. They have different political backgrounds and ideals. They have different languages that we're unaccustomed to. And a lot of people saw this as a threat. These people don't dress like us. They don't think like us. They don't talk like us. They don't even worship like us. And so they were seen as different. Often because of these differences, these immigrants faced heavy discrimination upon arrival. Those who were already here saw these groups sometimes as lesser people, clinging to certain stereotypes about each of these nationalities. For example, many were considered to be uneducated or undereducated. Others were considered to be groups that had high birth rates, and that there was this fear that they would have so many babies that the new arrivals would soon outnumber the old arrivals. They blamed or were fearful of these new arrivals taking over local politics and changing things at the local level and eventually at the national level. There was even a fear that Catholics. Catholicism was a big issue here in terms of a discrimination. People were fearful that these new arriving Catholic people would seek to change their schools to Catholic schools or put in papal law instead of American law. And so we see some of the discrimination along the way. Now, a lot of this fear and discrimination was based upon, again, these preconceived notions of one group looking at another group, which were supported during this period through the ideas of social Darwinism and the ideas of eugenics. Social Darwinism, to kind of distill it to its essence, is that just like in nature under Darwin and the survival of the fittest, in the human world, certain nationalities, certain groups are inherently superior to others. And what we see here as these new immigrants come in is kind of this application of social Darwinism in the United States. Some groups, the ones that are already here, see themselves as superior to those who are coming in. And they don't want these new groups coming in to change anything. The fear was that the term they often used in the early 1900s especially was the idea of miscegenation. The idea that this new group's going to come in and, for lack of a better term, breed with our older groups that are already here and will dilute our superiority. Their new ways will create what one person one time called a mongrelization of American society that will get rid of all the positives that we already have, was the argument, and create a new breed of person that would share the traits of those lesser groups coming in. This was also the idea of eugenics, which is a very popular pseudoscientific theory at the time. Eugenics, the idea that whenever groups get together and produce something new, in other words, they have sex and produce children, that sometimes those children take on the lesser qualities of the lesser group. And so the best way to maintain your high quality original is to make sure you don't breed, again, a very horrible term, but what they used at the time, with these lesser groups. So what's driving a lot of this anti-immigrant rhetoric during this period is this discrimination based upon the idea that these are lesser people who are going to disrupt our way of life thanks to the large number of them who were arriving, and they would use their numbers to, outvote us, to bring in new policies and new forms of education, new forms of government that were different from what we were used to, and create maybe an undesirable element within our nation that many people were fearful of. And again, all of this is based upon these pseudo-scientific ideas that were very popular at the time, and eventually will go on to cause amazing amounts of complications in Europe, especially by the 1930s with the rise of Nazism in Germany, the ideas of eugenics and superiority of different races and things like that. What we're focusing on in the United States during this period will be around in this country and in Europe for decades to come. And as a result of these feelings and this rhetoric, you're going to see a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment in the country during the late 1800s and during the 1900s as well, as people push back against these new arrivals. You'll see groups form like the American Protective Association, the APA, in the Midwest, which was this secret society that formed around 1887 in Iowa. And at one point, it's said to have had about 2 million members. And this group was basically formed because they were fearful that more and more Catholics were coming to this country, and they wanted to find ways to limit the influence of Catholic politicians and Catholic voters. And so what they did, the APA, the American Protective Association, was they supported politicians who were strongly anti-Catholic and got them elected to office. They wrote pamphlets and books on the dangers of Catholicism in America in terms of changing our school system and our laws and that sort of thing. And again, this was a very popular group. It had 2 million members, it's estimated, at its height. So it's an example of this anti-immigrant sentiment and the formation of groups designed to fight immigration. Once World War I ends and the number of immigrants coming to this country, the United States, begins to increase again, now that the conflict is over, we'll see a rise of nativism during this period as well, during the 1920s. And it's during this decade where we see the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan in this country. The first had been during Reconstruction, as African Americans kind of tried to exercise their rights, both politically and socially and economically. And we'll see this kind of happen again in the 1920s as the Klan reforms. And the Klan this time around, which reforms, by the way, due in a large part to the release of this movie called Birth of a Nation. They got their idea to reform the Klan. The people who reformed the Klan got their idea from watching this movie. And they'll have this big kind of ceremony on Stone Mountain in near outside of Atlanta, Georgia. That'll be the second birth of the Klan. And this time around, the Klan is not just a group dedicated to minimizing or intimidating African Americans. This time around, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s is going to be a much more broad and ambitious type of hate group. They're going to target anybody who's seen as un-American, such as Jewish people, Catholic people, immigrants from the undesirable countries of Italy and Eastern Europe. And essentially, this new Klan, which gains a huge presence, not just in the South, but across the country during this period, in places as far away as Ohio and Indiana and throughout the Midwest and so on, you'll see that the Klan sees themselves as kind of this protector of true America, or what they consider to be true America, against these hordes of incoming immigrants. And they are the keepers of the virtue of America. This is their point of view, right? And so the Klan is going to target immigrants. They're going to target those who don't necessarily fit the mold of what they consider to be a stereotypical American. And they'll gain a lot of success and a lot of influence during this time period. They'll have politicians elected to office. They're usually out in the open too. There's no secretness of the Klan this time. They're out in the open with their masks off. And they, again, present themselves as defenders of American virtue. And it works during the 1920s. Their job was to make sure that you stayed American. And if you didn't stay truly American, according to what they thought American was, then they would intimidate you or use violence against you. And for them, if you were considered to be un-American if you wanted to end the prohibition of alcohol, which was in effect at the time. If you were encouraging or a labor union member or encouraging labor union membership, you were un-American. If you dressed immodestly as a woman, you were considered to be un-American. If you practiced any sort of sexual freedom during the 1920s, which kind of gained ground during this period, un-American. Basically anything that was outside of what they considered to be normal was now considered to be un-American and unpatriotic. And therefore, you had to either conform or leave. Love the country or leave it, according to what they believed the country should be. And the Klan, like I said, is going to be around for a while during the 1920s. Ironically, what destroys the Klan by the end of the decade is that the Klan leadership in various organizations, various chapters across the country, will become embroiled in a number of controversies, a number of scandals, murder, adultery, pornography, the use of alcohol. And so the Klan will die out because they became hypocrites to a certain degree and were kind of like practicing what they were preaching against. But their example and the popularity of the Klan goes to show how widespread anti-immigrant sentiment was, especially by the post-World War I period throughout the country during the 1920s. One prominent group that was heavily discriminated against, especially in the late 1800s or by the late 1800s, were the Chinese who settled on the western coast of the United States, in California especially. Chinese immigrants who had started coming to this country in the 1840s and 1850s as part of the gold rush, and who stayed around to work on the railroads once the gold rush was over, and to own shops and businesses in places like San Francisco during this period. And their discrimination was based upon not just because they looked different and dressed different and acted different, although that was part of it. It made them easy to single out that way. But a lot of the discrimination that they faced was the result of a shortage of jobs in that part of the country. In fact, you'll see everywhere in the United States that the issue of jobs and the demand for jobs will be a huge motivating factor for anti-immigrant experiences, or anti-immigrant sentiment during this time period. But in California especially, many of the settlers, non-Asian settlers who lived there, who found it difficult to find work, blamed it on the Chinese people who lived there, the Chinese immigrants, who said that corporations would rather employ Chinese immigrants for less money than they would us because we want more money. And instead of getting angry at the corporations who controlled the labor forces or who controlled the jobs in California, these settlers got mad at the Chinese people. And you'll see a number of occasions where groups of non-Chinese people will physically assault Chinese immigrants. Sometimes these result in massacres where dozens of Chinese people will be killed as a result of this dispute over jobs. Fears began to grow in California that more and more Chinese immigrants and Asians in general would come to the United States and begin to overrun them. And they began to refer to this in the newspapers and other publications as the Yellow Peril, this wave of Chinese people and other Asian immigrants who would come in and basically consume and subsume more traditional Americans in their wake. Now, that was never going to happen. There were never a large number of Asian people coming to this country, but that was the fear kind of promoted to justify the actions taken against the Chinese. In fact, to give you an idea of the rhetoric, California governor in 1862, so we're going back a little bit further here, but it gives you an idea. The California governor, his name is Leland Stanford, who would help to found Stanford University later on. He had a quote one time talking about this issue of the Yellow Peril. And he said, "Asia, with her numberless millions, sends to our shore the dregs of her population. To my mind, it is clear that the settlement among us of an inferior race is to be discouraged by every legitimate means." And so that's exactly what happens. Going beyond the violence inherent in the otherness that was seen in Chinese immigrants, and the quote fear, or rather quote threat they presented to other quote normal Americans, you'll see the government itself begin to pass laws designed to limit the immigration of Chinese people to this country. In 1882, under the heavy influence of the California Congressional Committee in Washington, D.C., you're going to see the federal government pass one of the first restrictive immigrant laws in this country with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And essentially what this act did was that it barred any Chinese person who was considered a laborer to come into this country. And it's going to extend beyond that in years to come to where it bars almost any Chinese person in general from coming to this country in order to work or to live, men or women. And so what we see with the Chinese Immigration Act is one of the first efforts to over time at least, completely bar a certain type of person, a certain ethnicity or nationality from coming to this country in order to settle and start a new life. The Chinese Exclusion Act won't be the only form of government law passed designed to prevent immigrants from coming to this country. In fact, what we see after 1882 into the early 1900s especially is that laws will be passed over and over again designed to curb the number of, quote, undesirable immigrants from coming to the United States during this time period. In 1907 and 1917, respectively, you have a couple of laws, immigration laws passed that kind of complement each other that were designed to make it more difficult for certain types of people to come and to enter the United States. These laws together required an arriving immigrant to be able to at least read a little bit of English before they entered the country. The idea being that to help you assimilate to the United States, that you are going to need to be able to read and speak English at some point. And so that was one of the minimum requirements right there. You'd be able to read English to a certain degree before you arrived. But this literacy test was only part of the application, part of the process. You could be excluded based upon these laws if you had some sort of mental or physical disability. There was a long list of undesirable traits that were not going to be allowed in according to this 1917 law. And this included people who were alcoholics, anarchists, contract laborers, criminals, convicts, epileptics, and in some harsher terminology, feeble-minded persons, idiots, illiterates, imbeciles, so on and so forth. You get the idea. And the 1917 Immigration Act took the idea of the Chinese Exclusion Act and expanded on it by passing what would become known as the Asiatic Barred Zone, that basically excluded anybody in Asia and the Pacific from coming to the United States as an immigrant. Beyond restricting Chinese immigration only, Now, the barred area stretched to include British India, Afghanistan, the Middle East, the Southeast Asian nations, and Pacific Islands. The thought was that these people who had these issues would be a drain on the United States and not really be able to contribute anything. And so the idea was to kind of keep them from coming and becoming part of the immigrant wave to America. So these are laws designed to weed out, for lack of a better term, the certain groups that are certain people anyway who did not seem to be fit enough to contribute to American society in one way, shape, or form. And the government's not going to stop there. Once the war is over and things kind of get back to normal, both in Europe and the United States, and more immigrants do try to come to this country by the 1920s, we see an effort once more to limit undesirable immigrants, especially those coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, to settle here. And the government will pass laws designed to make sure that that does not happen. It will pass laws designed to ensure that the number of people coming from a place like Italy, an undesirable country, doesn't really outnumber those coming from more desirable countries like Germany or Northern European nations. In 1924, for example, the government will pass the 1924 Immigration Act, or what's also called the National Origins Act. And essentially what this act does is that it places a quota system on who can come from which country to the United States. The idea was, well, we can let in a certain number of people from Italy, but we're going to match that with a certain number of people from Germany. That way, the groups coming in will be evenly matched, and we'll have just as many desirable people coming from Germany as we would undesirable people coming from a place like Italy or from Romania or a place like that. So the goal here was to limit the influx of the undesirable types of immigrants that we saw at the time as a nation, in order to maintain the status quo about who was on top and who had power in this country during this period. And the National Origins Act of 1924, that is American law, that is U.S. law for decades to come. In fact, the National Origins Act won't be repealed until 1965 with the Immigration Act of 1965. So it's around for a long time. It gets changed a little bit in terms of the numbers allowed in and from where, but it's indicative of the efforts to limit the immigration from certain areas of the country or certain areas of the world into this country during this time period.